everybody's been sort of blown away with how severe the storm was and the failures, I guess, of the responses to fix this up. But you really have to take everything into context. We've just come off the back of probably the most unprecedented bushfire crisis, probably in the nation's history, and all of the infrastructure damage that was caused by those fires. We've also had, unprecedented rain in recent times. We've just come off the back of quite a severe drought, and our emergency responses are stretched to breaking point. And the best way I can describe this is a failure of small government and of deregulation. It's writ large. Anybody who's been arguing for smaller government should take a very long, hard look at themselves and say that it's not working here in this case.
Well, what are the motivations for privatisation when the Ausgrid was sold off back in 2015?
It's not just Ausgrid though; it was all of the distributors.
All the
so we're not just talking about Ausgrid; we're talking about Endeavour Energy and Essential Energy as well. So
privatisation of the network. One of the motivations was that private companies could do it more efficiently. They could do it better than public entities. Yeah. So how would you respond to that in light of what's gone on over the last week?
Well, so it's a twin failure though. There was the promise was that we would get better services and it would be cheaper. Well, please somebody put their hand up and tell me, unless you've gone off the grid or you've invested quite heavily in solar power, whether your power bill's gone down. Taking the carbon price off was supposed to do that. Well, my bill's gone up. I don't know about you guys.
Same, gone up.
Yep, gone up.
Every time they do something, it goes up.
Yeah, and also, those of us in the North Shore, particularly up in this area, will remember November. We had severe storms in November. I was without power for 4 days. Maximum respect to the hardworking men and women of our utilities companies who are out there in horrific conditions, making sure and putting their lives at risk, who are making sure that people get their power back on as quickly as possible. But really, they have been stretched to breaking point. We've seen fairly significant job cuts across these distributors since the privatisation was put on the table. And as I said at the start, people should now be asking whether this is a good thing. Where's the social benefit here? That's what I always think of it. Have our bills come down? No. Are we getting better services? No. We're having to bring the army in. We're having to bring workers from interstate to make up the shortfall. And a lot of people, and I know a lot of people would be voting Conservative up here, should be asking themselves some hard questions. And it's only going to get worse.
Just a question from me, Steve. This morning I heard on the radio another channel, a commercial one, and an Ausgrid representative was on there, and he made the point that it was unprecedented. We would never have had enough staff anyway to deal with this, and that's why we actually called in people from interstate. Is there merit in that?
Well, it's a bit of a lame argument, because when you cut so many people, you're always going to be behind the 8 ball anyway.
But just following the point, Biz, you wouldn't want to have a workforce that is too much and a lot of people standing around when you don't have emergencies. So
that's a really good point that you made. We talk about future-proofing things, and as the population grows, the demand for electricity will increase. Okay, as the number of climate-induced weather events, whether they be the storms or windstorms or whatever they are, plus bushfires, is going to increase. So we need to make sure that there's enough capacity in the existing labour force to be able to deal with those situations. So to this notion of people standing around doing nothing is a nonsense.
So it's a nonsense. Sorry to interrupt, just to follow up then, in this globalised world, aren't we talking about then the ability to collaborate across the nation when there are crisis points, that these different companies could actually have a sharing arrangement and therefore have their bottom cost manageable. But when there's an issue, we bring them in from South Australia, Victoria, and the rest of it, because
So
it's pretty close to. It hasn't been all over the country, but I do accept it's pretty widespread, the issues we've been having.
Yeah, well, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that it could be more national as well going forward. But it's a decision of the regulator to limit the amount of money that these companies can take. Okay, that's the issue. So it gives them very stark choices about what they invest in the actual hardware or the personnel. Okay, so that's a decision of the regulator imposed upon the company. All right, but I think people now would accept that if they had the choice, they would prefer more people to be available to restore their power and get them back functioning for a whole host of reasons, than to be waiting for a week in a first world nation like Australia. Okay.
And particularly, I think up this way. I mean, there are problems up this way. It's the biggest sub-metropolitan area in the whole of Australia. You know, we know what the problems are with the topography of Barara and, you know, over there, all those lawyers living in Dural, in Galston.
Any opportunity.
Any opportunity for Neil here. We need to be talking about retired ICT people.
I guess, though, what struck me about this is two things. One is 2-3 years ago, everyone was, you know, our government was complaining about the, you know, saying higher electricity prices are due to the gold-plated distribution system we now have, and I think this has shown it up that this is not gold-plated. Right? I mean, the experiences we've had is not gold-plated. And secondly is, normally in times of disaster and crisis, the population comes together and works, but I'm not seeing that. You know, works to solve the problem. I'm not seeing that out here. What I'm seeing is everyone complaining that, you know, their services aren't delivering what we were promised.
I think you're right, because it's one thing to be without. We have a massive storm, and you think the power goes down. You have a blackout, a day, maybe 2 days. But when you're facing now, you're running into the 6th day without power, and they're telling us. And it is really, that's the other point, is it's really hard to get information about how long you're going to be out for. So it's one thing to plan for an outage that might go for 24 hours as opposed to go for a whole week in terms of making provisions to get your food, stop wastage, etc. And it's really difficult to get information.
That's a very good point, Justine, because schools and large organisations have emergency management plans. And the number one thing in an emergency management plan is communication. And maybe we could ask the question, you know, what was the emergency management plan by these companies that were dealing with it? And maybe that's a space for further investigation.
Yeah, I must admit, I found the Ausgrid website quite helpful. You know, it had that map. It was helpful in showing me that, you know, it was a disaster. and even the point where you know, you would see on the map that, you know, of the outages, that some streets, like half the street had power, and the other half didn't. And that information then begged the question is why, you know, why has my next door neighbour got power but I haven't?
Well, I don't profess to be an expert on how they decide what gets fixed first, but I am sure there would be a prioritisation of critical assets, and you know, depending on the scale of the destruction, you know, there were people calling into the local ABC radio saying there were trees that had fallen across power lines, literally being held up by the power lines. So that was another branch of emergency response that had to go in and deal with the tree and coordinating all these different emergency responders. And you know, I guess going forward, there's always lessons learned from these events. But the one thing that we know is that they're only going to get worse. The scale of this is a real warning to people about the potential damage from you know, climate-induced weather events and bushfires, etc.
Well, I think the community is really exhausted because people were being told throughout the bushfire season, some of those threatened communities were told, we don't have the resources to come to your aid. You need to get out because we're just too stretched and we cannot help you. So prepare for the worst. And now they're being told, well, we don't have the resources to get you back. You've lost power or you've been flooded. So I think people are feeling
abandoned.
Well-
Yes. And then, as you say, we are in a first world country, and sometimes I do feel a bit churlish because if I'm complaining about the loss of power and the overall scheme of things, given what some people have lost over this summer, it's very, very minor by comparison. But I think people are getting a bit fed up.
Well, there are other aspects to this as well that haven't really been discussed at length. Economies have been destroyed in some of these small rural communities, and that's something that we've really got to be conscious of. And going down there and spending your coin is one of the best things that people could do. And how you rebuild these businesses and communities after these events. Towns like Mogo. Beautiful places on the south coast. The other factor, though, is the psychological damage that's been caused by these events as well, particularly bushfires. And then you've got these storm events on top as well, with flooding and all that sort of thing. The amount of trauma that's now being experienced by people, real, genuinely heartfelt trauma, we need to deal with that, and that's going to be ongoing. Children are going to be affected by these things as well. So it's another cost that comes from this as well. It's not just the cuts to services, but it's the ongoing cost to society from all of these other events and all of these other attachments, I guess is a crappy word, but
I think it plays against the weakness of fragile employment now as well, doesn't it? Is that how many people now are on, I think the figure is, 40% of its Australian workforce is on contract now.
Yeah, it's a cancer.
And if they can't work, they don't get money.
That's exactly right.
Whereas 20, 30 years ago, there would be some cash to, even if they weren't working, to carry them over.
Well, these people are getting New Start, $40 a day. How do you live on $40 a day? Help me understand that.
I find that incredibly perplexing too. When you've got the Reserve Bank governor coming out and saying that to raise New Start would be good for the economy, and you've got all of these quite conservative institutions suggesting that it's just insufficient and it would actually provide the stimulus that we are needed, particularly in those regional communities, to raise. I just am so perplexed as to what the rationale, why the government won't recognise these calls from not just socialists, not just the socialists out there screaming for it. It's people that, conservative economists.
Well, the business unions are very good at what they do.
The Business Council.
The business unions.
Right, the business unions,
Yes,
absolutely.
that's
But
what they
also
are.
the Business Council too, so on both sides.
Absolutely. I was reading something recently about the minimum wage issue in the United States, in some of the states over there, and henny penny, the sky's falling, and if you give people $15 an hour to work. Well, some of the states and some jurisdictions have actually done that, and the economic evidence is it actually improves the economy. When you give people a pay rise, I'm glad you talked about casualised work. It's a cancer in our society. And the evidence is in now that the best economic stimulus you can give people is a pay rise. It's a pay rise. I think I could talk about this for ages.
Yeah, we saw that in 2008, where the government at the time, the Rudd government, gave $1,000 to everybody.
Yeah.
I forget
Yeah,
what
there
the
were two
exact figure
payments.
was.
There were two. Yeah, it was
and that money came straight out and straight into the economy, and saved. It was one of the many things that saved Australia from the GFC at the time. So, to any governments listening out there, I'd like $1,000. I'd like it now.
But my question is, what would you spend it on now?
I would spend it on, what would I spend it on? I wouldn't spend it on anything. In fact, giving it to me is a waste of time. I would just go
I think that's the point. We don't want to digress too much, but I think then the importance of that was that they spent it in the shops.
That's exactly right.
But I think now people are spending it on their mortgages or something like that to give them a bit of
Retirement
buffer.
debt.
Yeah.
And that's not going to stimulate the economy.
But New Start, they're saying that
Yeah.
if you raise New Start, 10% will come straight back to the government through goods and services tax in any case, but that money will go directly back into the economy, and particularly these regional rural economies that are really suffering and need the boost. That's probably a really effective way of giving it.
Yeah, and I think, without getting into an argument, your example derives from tax cuts, which disproportionately go to the wealthy rather than the poor. So, when you're getting an extra $2 a week in your pay packet, it's not going to make any change to your
Your spending habits.
habit. And if you're, getting an extra $2,000 from a tax cut, well, you don't need the tax cut, really, do you? You don't need the extra dough.
Yeah, well, just show me one single
Oh,
example.
sorry, Steve, we're cutting our
That's
close.
okay.
Our guest, there he is
That's
over in the
okay.
corner there.
Just show me one example of trickle-down economics working. Okay, I have never seen. I'm yet to read any qualitative or quantitative evidence that trickle-down works. If you just keep cutting taxes and cutting taxes, which is what the Conservatives were saying during the GFC, they supported the first round of stimulus, but the second round of stimulus they said, oh no, this is too much. It's going to wreck the economy. Just keep cutting taxes. Just keep cutting taxes. Well, what do we get to zero? You know, come on.
Well, we're going to have to interrupt it there because we have to listen to some station sponsors and then we'll have time for the news. After the break, we're going to be talking about what's gone on in the council meeting. You're very welcome to stay and join us, Steve, but thank you so much for coming in and having a chat.
We are actually going to have a small section on Valentine's Day after the news.
There is a romantic amongst us.
There is.
So stay with us.
Right, thanks, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Went
Yeah,
too
you're welcome.
quickly.
That was great,
Don't
wasn't
go
it?
quickly, it just flew by.